Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to my stream. Title of this video, or at least a concept that's covered in it, is the idea of checks and imbalances. Right, sort of a play on words. The American government, the design of the American government, is based on some principle of checks and balances, or at least an attempt at checks and balances. The play on words is checks, right? Checks and imbalances is a play on that term, and the key idea here is that what we have is we have the judicial, executive, and the legislative branch, and the one interesting aspect of this system is that there's an executive veto function, right, within this system. There's an executive veto power as a part of the legislative process, right? So the executive, being the president, has the ability to veto new incoming pieces of legislation that he or she regards as inappropriate or politically, disadvantageous to his or her party, or their interests, or their ideologies, or their principles. But in any case, that particular, and the whole purpose of the executive branch, the whole purpose of the president is to, one, the role of president and commander-in-chief are not contained in separate offices. They're contained in the same office, which is to say that the president is the commander-in-chief and has wide, discretionary decision-making power in military matters as the commander-in-chief, as implied by that term. Sorry, my computer's screen turned off. Let me just turn that back on. Oh, I turned the wrong password. Sorry, folks. Gonna have little technical issues at times. Okay. In any case, we're back. Alright, so, okay, where was I? President also, we typically look at the executive branch as the, the implementation of law, the judicial branch as the interpretation of law, and the legislative branch as the creation of law, or the design of law. And so that's the executive serves this implementationary role in law and in policy. And then the executive also has this, so the executive serves this it implements the law, and the president, as the executive, acts as the commander-in-chief. He has discretionary decision-making power in military matters, right? So the executive is the executive branch is the epicenter of epicenter of power over military affairs, and the executive also has a legislative role in his or her capacity, in the president's capacity, to veto pieces of legislation. Of course, that veto can be overridden, but it's still a legislative. It's a legislative power that the president has as the executive, even though the executive is separate from the legislative branch officially. Executive has some role in the legislative process. So, in any case, where were we? We're discussing. Oh yeah. Now, one interesting thing is that this is the executive branch of the American government, right? We have power over military affairs. We have a role in the legislative process and serving in carrying out the veto power. And finally, generally speaking, the executive is about implementing law, judicial interpretation of law, legislative, the creation of law. Now, all of that's general political science gobbledygook. I mean, it's not, you know, very high-level political science concepts there. They're not. But in any case, that's sort of, well, those concepts are introductory, right, to the point that I'm making in this video. So, in any case, yeah. Now, as I was thinking yesterday, you know, this is supposed to be a system of, you know, checks and balances, but you know, at least when I consider this, right, that the executive has this veto power, right, as a part of the legislative process, right, as law and policy is issued from the United States government and created, interpreted, validated, and implemented by it. Executive checks legislative branch. Executive branch can check legislative branch with this veto power, right? And of course, it's not an absolute veto power. It's very much the weight of a presidential veto is only as strong as it only matters if, how would I put this? So it only matters if it really doesn't matter ultimately, because that veto can be overridden. So that's all I'm saying there. Now, okay, so in this sense, as a part of the legislative process, the executive branch, embodied in the president, has, checks the legislative branch or Congress in the legislative process with this veto power that goes in, which is unidirectional, right? It's, executive has this veto power that it can use to check and balance Congress, right? More to check than balance, but you get the point, right? That's how the concept of checks and balances, sort of comes into this whole discussion. And the thing is as I've just noted, the veto power in that dynamic between the executive and the legislative is unidirectional. It's a power that the executive can exert against the legislative branch to check it in some way. And as I was thinking about this last night, I said there's, at least in that, the fact that veto power is unidirectional and that it's directed, it can be, it's a power that Congress checks the executive, right, just as the executive checks Congress in other ways, right, in more implicit and indirect ways. But it seems odd to me that if we want a system of checks and balances, right, if that's a basic design principle that is worth preserving, why would it be unidirectional, right? I mean, if the executive, why would it be why would that be a province, a specific capacity of the executive branch in the legislative process against the executive against the legislative branch or Congress? I mean, it's just, in that sense, that's why I've sort of made the play on words checks and imbalances, right? Because it just seems odd to me that the fact that executive checks legislative with this veto power, but the legislative does not check the executive with a similar veto power. seems odd to me. Instead of checks and balances there, we seem to observe checks and imbalances, right? And that's it's sort of a basic contradiction, right? With the fundamental design principles upon which the whole system was constructed. And so, yes, it is true that Congress doesn't exactly have a Congress does not have a veto power that it can direct against the executive in the same way that the executive has a veto power that it can direct against the legislative or Congress. It seems to me that if we want to maintain the basic design principle, right, which we regard as philosophically valid in a political science sense, in a political theory sense, well, in general, what I'm saying is that this represents checks and imbalances. And if we want to stick to that basic design principle, which I think is good, I think that, it's obviously good because it makes power check power. And, power checked by some power equal to itself limits, so would limit the extent to which that power can be enforced either frivolously or excessively. Now, I think it may actually be somewhat advantageous for this veto power between the executive, this veto dynamic between the executive and the legislative. I think there may be some advantage to that being bidirectional, right? Rather than unidirectional, meaning going in both ways. Meaning, in the same way that executive checks legislative with the veto power, there's some other way in which legislative checks executive with a similar veto power. Or, if not a veto power, a power of review, right? And I think that, obviously Congress has extensive review powers over the executive in matters relating to bureaucracy, military, and even some of the legislative things that the executive branch does. Extensive oversight powers. Regardless, I think that there's sufficient oversight by Congress over the executive with regard to bureaucratic implementation of laws. And, bureaucracy is the medium through which legislation is enforced in some sense, or at least carried out to some extent. Police can be regarded as a part of that bureaucracy, although they're not traditionally regarded as a part of that bureaucracy. But it's an extensive network that flows outward from the executive that then allows the law to be enforced. So, in any case, Congress, has oversight over the legislative dimensions of the executive branch, of the executive branch's activities. It can override the presidential veto, right, as a part of the legislative process, as the executive and the legislative work things out between themselves, come to some standard of, some common agreement on what's good legislation, what constitutes good legislation, depending on the political moment. But the president, one thing to note about the executive, the president has extensive discretion over military matters. Not just matters relating to immediate conflict. Obviously, the president has much power there when these types of moments of immediate conflict actually arise, right? So, which is probably not all that common, right? Unless we're talking about a seriously, unstable area, militarily unstable area, politically unstable area, such as the Middle East and whatnot. There are probably multiple instances in each president's tenure where, they're going to have to make quick decisions in moments of immediate conflict. But generally what the president is doing as the commander-in-chief is he is directing the military, not really making improvisational decisions in moments of immediate conflict, but making more long-term strategic decisions about about military occupation, about where the military is going to concentrate its activities, where bases are going to be built, where those bases have jurisdiction, things of that sort, right? And obviously Congress has some role to play in this as well, but this is largely a province of I believe it is anyway, right, of the executive branch. The president obviously is the commander in chief as it relates to the military, and because the military relates much to war, Congress has to approve war. This is one way in which Congress checks the military power of the executive, right? But obviously, when the president needs to make decisions in moments of immediate conflict, he doesn't have time. There's simply not, there's a time dimension there. And with the limited time that a decision needs to be rendered, there is no opportunity for collaboration between Congress and the president. It requires sole discretion, sole decision-making on the part of the president, perhaps. But I think that at least as the executive directs the military, right, in matters of occupation, constructing bases, updating military equipment, stationing military equipment, stationing how would you say it? Military, stationing, the military in various places. I think at least when it comes to those, I think at least when it comes to the more long-term strategic decision-making that the executive is doing, with regard to how the military how the U.S. military is distributed across the world, essentially how it's distributed across the world and concentrated in certain areas, and what it's doing in those areas, where military equipment is stationed, where bases are placed and constructed, and yada yada yada. I think it may be beneficial for Congress to have some sort of veto or review power over these types of decisions that the executive is making. And in this way, we would, if we establish some congressional veto power, right, that checks the executive in the same way that there's an executive veto power that checks the legislative, we would no longer have checks and imbalances in this regard. We would have checks and balances. And I think that establishing such a congressional veto power or review power, right? Because every veto power is also a power of review. You have to review the thing that you're going to either veto or not veto before you can decide whether to veto it or not veto it. The power of review is implicit in the power to veto. But I think it may be beneficial not only to preserve the basic design principle of checks and balances, which we regard as philosophically valid, but also to ensure that the executive's discretion, right, his or her power over the military, is checked by Congress, which is to be checked more by Congress, which is to be checked more and more by the people. We don't want the executive to have these ostentatious and inflated military authority, ostentatious and inflated military authority or military power. We would regard that as a danger, and that's probably throughout the history of our government, and the executive's rule over matters of the military. The way that we have distributed power in our system and checked that power with regard to the military, I think that's proven, throughout history to generate problems of various kinds. in various instances. And so it may be advantageous, right? Congress already must approve war if the president deems it necessary to declare it. Congress has extensive oversight over the executive's role in implementing the law through bureaucracy. Congress can override a veto, so it essentially can veto a veto, an executive veto. In all of these aspects, there are checks. We've preserved the design principle of checks and balances by checking, the executive or the legislative against the executive appropriately. But I think, at least as it concerns the president's role in issuing decisions, long-term strategic decisions about matters of not of immediate military conflict or of matters of war, but more over the long-term strategic decisions that the executive is making about what I'll call military occupation and military stationing. I think Congress should have a veto power, right, directed against the executive with respect to this domain of military decision making. And if we can create a legislative check against the executive in this regard, we could eliminate the checks and imbalances dynamic that we see here and preserve the design principle of checks and balances, right? So, not a very complicated idea, but it's just the simple fact that if we're going to preserve checks and balances, the executive can check the legislative with a veto, then in some other respect where executive powers become too enlarged, we've got to have a check of the legislative against the executive even more. And especially when it comes to matters of military occupation and military stationing and all of these long-term, non-immediate military decision-making that the president engages in, which has consequences that ripple throughout, long after each president's term, we've got to have more legislative oversight here. And I think a congressional veto power against executive decision-making in this regard, would be appropriate, right? That way the people, right, as embodied in their representatives in Congress, can evaluate immediately these discretionary military decisions that the executive is making with regard to military occupation and stationing, long-term strategic decisions, can review those decisions to make sure that they're appropriate. And I think in general, the founders thought, well, we've got to embody all of these, enlarged discretionary decision-making powers in the executive with regard to the military, because, well, they were focused on the fact that we need, in moments of, they were focused on the dimension of, the fact that, at least at their time, the executive would need primarily, right? They weren't thinking about occupation, right? The founders weren't thinking about long-term military decisions with respect to occupation or stationing. They didn't really enter their minds that the American government would engage in these types of activities, right? That we would occupy with bases other countries and other parts of the world, either through a desire for some sort of, conquest, or how would I put it, or influence, right? That really didn't enter their minds. They didn't think that the executive would so much be doing that. They really thought, well, we give the executive these powers because he's got to decide and make quick decisions, snappy decisions in moments of immediate conflict, and that's mostly what he's going to be presiding over with regard to the military. Many of the founders didn't even think that we should have a military. We shouldn't have like a standing army or anything like that. They thought that was a threat to liberty, right? And so, they weren't really considering this, what the executive has begun to do throughout history, which is to make decisions about how, the military should occupy and be stationed in different parts of the world so that we can exert control and influence in these areas, or preserve the stability of an alliance, or whatever. And so, yeah, and obviously they considered war, but, with respect to war, they did add a congressional power to review the decision to declare war. Congress has to approve that decision, right? So, it's very interesting. Now, but because, throughout time the executive has taken on this larger role of directing the military in matters of occupation and stationing in various parts of the world for the sake of influence and control and whatever, I think Congress, that power of the executive needs to be checked, right? Otherwise, it's unchecked, and there's an imbalance there that can cause problems, obvious problems, right? Overly extensive occupation of our military in the world in ways that don't make sense either strategically or ethically, right? So I think that in the same way that we have an executive veto against the legislative, we need to have some sort of legislative veto against the executive with regard to the executive's role in making these long-term decisions with regard to military occupation and stationing. And if we have a bidirectional veto power, executive checks legislative with a veto, legislative checks executive with a veto of some kind, we preserve the design principle of checks and balances. What would this look like more concretely to concretize the idea? Well, before the executive could make now we wouldn't really. Okay, so essentially how this would work is when the executive is having to decide, render a quick decision in moments of immediate conflict, then we wouldn't so much have a congressional veto against that, but a power of congressional review over that decision, over that executive decision, so that Congress can evaluate whether the decision rendered in that moment of immediate conflict was valid, ethically and strategically. So, in that sense, it would be a veto after the fact, right? After the decision is made, rather than before, right? Or during. This wouldn't make sense. I mean, how could you veto a decision that was already made? And yeah, that's an obvious point. But basically, then it wouldn't so much be a veto as it would be a power of review, to review the decision to make sure that it made sense ethically, politically, and strategically. Now, when we're talking about military decisions in matters of, long-term strategy, military occupation and stationing, the instances in which the executive is directing military leaders in specific directions towards specific actions, I believe that in those decisions, right, where there is time for a veto before the decision is made, and during the decision-making process, I think in those matters, there should be a power of congressional veto against the executive. How that would work, the executive, in his discussions with his military leaders, or his military underlings, there's an important decision they're attempting to make. He renders a decision. It's not a simple matter anymore of him issuing that decision to the military and the military acting upon it. The president would need to issue the decision first through notification to Congress, so that Congress can evaluate the decision to ensure that that decision is good, that it's compatible with ethical principles, that it's strategically valid, that it's something that does not harm the long-term interest of the country. And if Congress deems that decision bad, it has the power to veto. Now, In the same way that the legislative can override the executive veto, could the executive override the legislative veto? Yes, because if you've watched my previous videos, I've done a whole re-engineering series on the government. And I've advocated for totally replacing a singular executive and completely removing a national executive branch, because we already have 50 state executives. And if the executive is just about implementing the law, if we've already got 50 executives to do that, why do we need one more in the role of the president? So in that sense, yes. Let's say that the executive notifies Congress of its decision in a particular military matter. Congress vetoes. Could the executives, right, in the role of the 50 state governors, in the form of, rather, could they, right, vote to override Congress's veto of that decision, of that particular decision? Yes, and it would work in very much the same way. So that's compatible with my previous re-engineering solutions that I've applied to the government. So and really this whole plan really wouldn't work unless that particular re-engineering solution was implemented first. So there would be this bidirectional veto power, at least with respect to a certain kind of military decision-making that I think is important. And we would regard as important from the perspective of checks and balances and ensuring that discretionary decision-making, that discretionary decisions, highly discretionary decisions, are checked and reviewed thoroughly before being implemented or carried out, so that the people or the people's representatives can determine whether those decisions are strategically good, ethically good, and I think that's important, at least with respect to that kind of decision making. It's very important that there be some, contrary power of review or countering power of review on the part of Congress. I think if we can go about establishing such a veto power, not just executive vetoing legislative, but legislative vetoing executive, we could stick to the design principle of checks and balances, and we wouldn't have this dynamic of checks and imbalances with regard to the military power of the executive, which is an area of decision-making that is incredibly important to be extremely scrutinizing of and extremely critical of, because if we're not critical enough of those decisions, wastes resources, harms the interests of the country and of those that are subjected to these decisions abroad, but have no say in whether or not they're carried out. At least with respect to this kind of military decision-making, we need to have more congressional oversight. And whether it's a decision on the part of the executive in a moment of immediate conflict that amounts to a veto after the fact, right? Which would, if president in a moment of immediate conflict has to make a decision, then after the fact, Congress thoroughly reviews that decision. And that the executive, knowing that there's going to be this review after the fact, is going to be much more careful. And I think that's why it's important to establish it in the first place. And as for decisions that do not need to be made in the immediate moment, long-term strategic military decisions of occupation and stationing, before the president issues that decision and the military acts on it, first Congress needs to intercede, needs to insert itself between presidential decision making and military action, so that it can determine whether the decision is good, right? Whether it makes sense. Now, and in that way, there's checks and balances. Executive checks legislative, legislative checks executive, both with veto powers. The main objection is this, right? Let's say the president's one party and Congress is controlled by another party, right? Because parties are a part of our system, and they're so entrenched in our system, what would inevitably happen if we had this this bidirectional veto power is that, whatever decision, if the president and the Congress are of opposite parties, then the president's not going to be able to act on anything. He or she is not going to be able to issue any decision, because the parties naturally contest each other rather than collaborate. They have a dynamic of extreme competition and conflict with each other. They don't cooperate and collaborate unless it's a politically neutral matter, and there is no such thing as a politically neutral matter for the parties. Everything becomes politically charged. So, that would be a problem. See, that would, this basic design proposal is actually good in theory, but when we have to take into account the reality of parties, it doesn't fall apart, but it certainly begins to crumble. Regardless, I think it's an interesting idea, and in this way, I think, we have the executive veto power in the legislative process because we don't want Congress to have unchecked power. Why would we want the executive then to have unchecked power in military matters? Congress, in the same way that the executive checks Congress, Congress needs to check the executive, right? Executive checks Congress in legislative matters, which is the province of the legislative. Legislative checks executive in military matters, which is the province of the executive. So, especially when it comes to the military decision making, especially when it comes to this area, the power of the executive needs to be checked. And if it's not effectively checked, we run too many risks, right? Human fallibility is too great, especially in moments of distress, which is always the case with any kind of military decision making. No, human fallibility is too great. And power only exaggerates that fallibility. So that power, the power that would then exaggerate the power that would then exaggerate the fallibility of the executive, needs to be checked by Congress. Just as the executive checks Congress, Congress needs to check the executive more and more and more, especially in matters of the military. So that's the proposal, and hopefully it elucidated some important points and mobilizes another one of my government reengineering ideas. Hopefully you enjoyed the idea, and hopefully I was able to explain it clearly enough for you to enjoy it. Thank you for watching, and like and subscribe.